Good morning. How are you doing? Good. It's so good to be with you. As Chris said, my name is Steve Rouse. I am church team director with LICC. The day that I got director in my title, I phoned my dad. And I said, Dad, they made me a director. What on earth is that all about? I still help to lead a Baptist church in South London, in Balham in South London. And I want to talk to you for a bit about this question of how do we release our congregations, our people, out into their world to change their world. And maybe as you enter into this session, maybe I could encourage you to think about a couple of friends, maybe that are part of your church. Try and have a couple of people in your mind that you think about as we go through this. Think about people that are in different contexts, different places. Maybe it be a student at school or college or university. Maybe it would be somebody in a particular work context. Try and have a couple of people in your mind. Maybe it's somebody that is retired. I didn't start off my working life in the church. I started off my working life working in Five Ways Co-op supermarket in Clacton-on-Sea up in Essex, where I was a master shelf stacker and trolley gatherer. I still can't help myself when I'm in Sainsbury's. Who am I protecting? Sainsbury's. I live in Balham. Waitrose. When I'm in Waitrose, I still have a sneaky kind of, if somebody's kind of not shuffled the stuff to the front, I like to bring the tins forward so that they look right on the shelf. I can't help myself. And I think my world record for trolley gathering was about 33 trolleys. And it was not like that. It was difficult coming back into the store, but 33 trolleys I managed. I left school when I was 16 years old. And as I left school, I went out into the world of work. And at that stage of my life, as a young disciple, I was definitely more of the world than in the world. My shift at Five Ways used to start on a Friday lunchtime at 2 o'clock. But the guys in the warehouse would meet in the pub at 1 o'clock to play pool before we started the shift at 2. So I was 6. What age should I say I was? I was 16. I would meet these guys in the pub. In the hour that we would play pool together, I'd probably drink, how many pints should I say I drank? 2 pints, let's say, and then I started my shift. It made the shift go really quick. I didn't really engage till about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was fantastic. But the world of work, the culture of it, shaped me much more than I shaped it at that stage of my life. When I reluctantly left trolley gathering, I went into the building trade, where I did my apprenticeship as a bricklayer. And daily on site, I was shaped more by Johnny Barrow than I was by Jesus Christ. Johnny Barrow was the guy, he was a master bricklayer that I labored for. And I wanted, as then an 18-year-old, I wanted to learn to be with Johnny, to become like Johnny, and learn to do the things that Johnny did. John Marcoma would have been so proud of me. I was definitely in the world, but I was definitely of the world, or the part of the world that I lived in. I was a product of my environment. It affects you. I grew up in a place called Frinton-on-Sea, where I'm 56 years old, and at the time that I grew up, the humor in the playground was all about people that were Irish, black, or gay. I didn't know anybody in Frinton-on-Sea who was Irish, or black, or gay. I was 27 years old when I moved to London, and I was shocked by what was already in here. I was shaped much more by the culture and the environment around me, on site, and just in the place where I grew up, than I was ever shaping it. And it was reinforced in every sphere of my life. It was reinforced in the church. I was definitely in the world, and I was definitely of the world. The thing was, when I got together with my church community, and maybe think about yours, when I was with my church community, in the worship, when we got together on a Sunday morning, the worship leader who stood up and said that phrase that I can't stand, and now we're just going to worship, but they would often say, forget about your life this week and just come in here and focus on Jesus. What does that say to people in their everyday context? They commissioned and released and made a huge fuss of people that went overseas to be missionaries or people who felt called into ministry. And the application of the sermon was so often, and still is, as a result of this message today, why don't you join one of our ministry teams? And the only thing that I was ever released to do in the world was to go out and evangelize in my workplace and not steal any of the paper clips from work. Well, there weren't too many paper clips on the building site. I went into the world of church work at the age of 27, leading a church community. And what I tried to do was replicate what I had experienced in the church community that I was a part of. 10 years into trying to build the next big church in London, I was on sabbatical. I was sat at home in my bed with all these ideas about what we might do next. And yet the reality was I was sitting there crying and not knowing why. It was in that moment that God began to remind me of where he had called me from. It was here on site where I really learned to be a disciple. And it's here on site and in other contexts where the conversations happen. Justin was talking about the kind of questions that people are asking today. And as he said that, I was reminded of when I used to work on site, even as a young 20-something, I can remember two brothers that I worked with. They were plasterers. I remember they came over. I was digging a foundation one day for an extension we were building, and they came over with their flask of coffee, and they sat with me, and they said, Steve, can we sit and talk to you? Mum died last week, and we don't know what to do about that. I think I was 21, 22 years old. I'd never lost anybody in my life at this point. The first funeral I ever attended was one that I was leading. And it was an open coffin funeral for a West Indian guy. And he was right underneath me, and it was an open coffin. They opened it right at the side. And I was looking over thinking, if this guy blinks, I'm out of here. But it was on site that those guys wanted to talk about the loss of their mum. I remember talking to a guy called Rick. I played squash with him, and he was a scaffolder, and he was forever ribbing me and taking the mickey out of me because I was a Christian. And yeah, I remember one night after we finished playing a squash match, he said, do you want to play pool? And I'd spent most of my teenage years playing pool. We went around to the pool table. He racked up the balls, and as he racked up the balls, he leant on the table and said, Steve, my marriage is coming apart. I've got a 4-year-old kid, and I don't know what to do. I don't know whether you bothered to get those people in your head or not, but your folk, the people in your church community, you go out into places every day of your life, and they'll be alongside people who want to have those kind of conversations. Nobody has ever asked me some huge existential question. They'll say, Mum died, or Dad died, or my brother died, or they're sick, or some question like that. And we're not even equipping one another for that. I went out into the world of church life to try and develop a church. And that moment on my sabbatical that was a crisis moment changed forever my trajectory as a church minister. Even here, we still talk about the church as an it and not as us as the community of people. It's a real challenge for us to get in our heads that idea that God has us as his people in all those different places. And when I was in that place, I'm pointing that way, that place, I didn't know it. I didn't know that God had called me there. I didn't know that that was my vocation. I didn't know that I was a priest for God in that place, because my church never told me that. They never opened my eyes to it. Mark Green, who used to be CEO of LICC, he said in an essay he wrote some years ago, as he looked at the church in the UK and he thought, how can we make a difference? He said 98% of Christians have neither been envisioned nor equipped for 95% of their waking lives. If 2% of your church community are employed by the church, then that leaves a whole bunch of other people who find themselves in significant places, but generally speaking are not envisioned nor equipped for it. And I think it's because of this. It was a penny-dropping moment for me when I first saw this quote. Because the mission strategy of many churches, whilst not stated this way, is something like this. That it is to recruit the people of God to use some of their leisure time to join the missionary initiatives of church-paid workers. Because we think that's what our job is. Whether you're a youth worker, families worker, senior minister, whatever it is, we think, I've got to create something and then try and twist the arms of people to come and join in with it. So how do we release our people to go out and change the world? Just a few thoughts for us just to get us thinking as we talk about them later on. How do we release those people? I think firstly, we need to release our people. We need to release ourselves from being the church to becoming the Ekklesia. Why do we say it that way? You know this already. Some of you know it really well, that this is what this conference is all about, and it's been spoken about already today, what Ekklesia actually means. The word gives us that right vision for the church that God calls us to be, a gathering of people who come together for a particular purpose, a movement who go out to participate in God's mission every day of their lives. But when the Bible was written in Latin, they would translate that word as church, meaning the place or the building where we meet. Jesus says to Peter, this school reject who has gone back into fishing, Jesus said to him, Peter, you are a small rock. I think I've got the verse up on the screen. And I tell you that you are, Peter, a small rock, and upon the large rock I will build my Ekklesia, my movement, my congregation, a community that will bring the way of heaven to earth. My understanding of that is that Rome had Ekklesias. Rome, as the power of the day, had outposts. And they said, what you're meant to do in those outposts is replicate the citizenship of Rome out in that place. So I love the idea that when Christians began to take on that idea, that what they were saying was, we are meant to replicate the citizenship of heaven, the way of the kingdom, in the communities and neighborhoods and places where we find ourselves. I thought that when I became a Christian that I was joining a church, but I was joining an Ekklesia. It's not that the church has a mission. It's the mission has a church. I don't know if you've ever seen this film, Shawshank Redemption. It's one of my favorites. At this moment in the film, the character played by Morgan Freeman is a guy called Red, and they're talking in the yard about a prisoner called Brooks who's about to be released from prison. He's been in prison for 50 years, and they're worried as to whether he can make it on the outside. And you see while they're talking in the yard, they cut every now and then to Brooks, who's left the prison. He's outside. He's trying to get a job. In fact, he works in a supermarket, if I remember rightly. But he doesn't make it. He takes his own life. And Red's trying to help them understand it. And he says this to them. He says, these wars are funny. First you hate them. Then you get used to them. Enough time passes. You get so you depend on them. That's institutionalized. In the church community that I've been a part of for nearly 30 years in Balham, I've noticed a lot of people, when they come to begin to connect with our church community, at first, they're really unsure of the walls. They'll even say something like, am I allowed to come in here? But over time, they come in and they get used to them. Enough time passes for some of our folk, it gets like they depend on the walls in order to be Christians. A lot of people know how to be Christians and know how to stand and sit, and they're expert churchgoers. They're great at being Christians within the walls of a church building. But would they make it on the outside? Would they be able to live and be the church in the places where they find themselves every day? These walls can be funny. We are those stones. When we think about being the Ekklesia, we are those stones. We are this community that is sent to shape and create the culture around us. We are a community of priests. I don't know what your tradition is, but we are a community of priests made in the image of God, called to represent him in all the different places that our people find themselves. Those of us, if you in the room, like me, have that responsibility of leading a church, just display one aspect of that. Tyndale, in his original version of the Bible, he translated the word and used the word Ekklesia, trying to recover that sense of being a movement. But the King James Bible, some years later, decided to translate it back into the word church. And since the year 1611, we've been shaped by a culture that makes the building the focus. Church in many parts has become Sunday-centric and building-centric and professional clergy-centric. And it seems to me that even in the sexier versions of church today, that the game still seems to be the same. We still seem to be replicating that way of being the church. It's time to put Ekklesia back in its place. If we're going to release disciples to change the world, then we and our posture needs to be about not which rota will you go on, but how can I equip and envision you for where you are, where you live, where you work, where you study, and where you play. How can we be a Monday to Sunday church community? If we're going to release people to change the world, then we need to release our people from being church goers to being whole life disciples. I think it was Richard Raw who said that. He said something along the lines of, we've done a great job in history at creating a church-going community, but we've not created disciples. I think many of us are aware in this moment of the need to kind of work out, how do we actually make disciples today? We need to release ourselves as church leaders from seeing our people as rota fodder and release them to be disciples making a difference wherever they are. We need to help them see that we are all called by God and that calling will get expressed in 1,000 different ways. If you're familiar with LICC at all, they use this. We use these dots to kind of help us understand this. This picture on the left here with the dots up in the corner, 6 dots in a square of 100, represents the gathered church community. It represents as well the percentage of people in our country that connect with the church community once a month or more. On the right, we see those same people out in the places where they live and work and study and play, coming into contact with so many more of whatever those appear to you, white or grey dots. In this picture, as a young church leader, I remember when we gathered on a Sunday, often the prayer would be with the church leader, somebody in the room would pray, Lord, as we meet this morning, we pray that as people walk past the building, that some may just pop in. I think in all the years that I've been part of church community, God's answered that prayer twice. Most people come into contact with the church and go to church, if you want to use that phrase, in that right-hand picture, not in the left-hand one. In fact, I said to our church in terms of that phrase, because language shapes culture, doesn't it? I said to our church, if you ever say again, I'm going to church on Sunday, you have to put £1 in the jar, and I put a jar on the communion table at the front. We don't go to church on Sunday. The church comes together in order to then go and actually be the church Monday through Sunday. 6%. So in London, for those of us who are from this particular city, a population of 8.9 million people. So approximately 540,000 people go out into London or the surrounding area every day as Christians. 540,000 people. And Jesus began with 12. At LICC, we think it's important to try and help our people to grasp and own the place where God has them. We call them their front lines. Don't trip over the word, but their frontline contexts, where they're alongside people that are not yet Christians, where they live, where they work, where they study, and where they play. Changing the world feels like an enormous task, but encouraging people to see that God has his people where they are to play their part in God's mission in the everyday feels a little bit more manageable. The significance of that place. As a church leader, when my eyes first were open to this, I made a huge shift. I thought, as churches, we make our programs so busy that our folk have no time to go and spend time with their neighbors or play a sport or whatever it is that they do. So I stopped a midweek lunchtime service that we did so that I could go back after 10 years of missing it to playing squash. And as I re-engaged with that, I found once again that was the place where the guys that I play squash with want to talk about the fact that when Colin, who I play with, got cancer a couple of years ago, prostate cancer, we sat at the back of the court after a match and he said, "Would you pray for me, Steve?" But it's not just about what we say. It's about the way that I play. I can't tell you the number of times that I've got home after playing a match of squash and I've had to take my phone out and text the guys and say, I'm so sorry for the way that I lost again today. I was appalling on the court because my eyes have been opened to the fact that it's way more than spoken evangelism. My life, just the way that I am, speaks to them, doesn't it? We are all called to the places where we are. And we're called, and you'll know this in many ways, but just to put it on your agenda for thinking about this when we speak about it in a moment. But we're all called to steward the earth. We're all called to do something with the raw material God has put in our hands. It took me ages to realize. I said I wasted my time in Clacton-on-Sea in the amusement arcades playing pool, and I used to play for a pub darts team. I tell you this, the most powerful pastoral conversation I ever had was over a game of darts. A young lad in our church who lost his dad way before he should have done. I was taking the funeral. He could not come to terms with the loss of his dad. And he was sat at the back of the chapel. And we went to the pub afterwards. We were having sandwiches. And he came over. He didn't know that I played darts. He said, Steve, do you fancy a game of darts? I said, sure. We played darts for 2 hours. As we walked up and down the Ocky, he poured out about the loss of his dad. God can use whatever you have in your hands, even if it's a set of darts. God can use whatever you've got if you'll offer it to him. He wants you to steward it. And God calls all of us to follow Jesus, and that will look different in different contexts and different moments. It looks different when you're a student leaving university going into the world of work. It looks different when you're transitioning in your work years. It looks different when you're transitioning into retirement. We're all called to belong to the church. Not belong in the sense of, like my tradition in Baptist, to be a member, but to belong in the sense to realize that we are always the church and we're all called to participate in the mission of God. And right now in our city, I think God has people in the world of retail and banking and construction and the care industry. He's got people positioned right now like those dots. And I think he's desperate to make a difference through them until we as the church and church leaders wake up to that. And stop this jolly empire building where it's all about trying to replicate what's going on in our little locality, which is important. But it's only where we practice, so that when we go out into those other places, we might transform those places. When my wife and I, Lisa, my wife and I got switched on to this, we very much saw our street as a front line. And we started to do these street parties. And it led to I never thought I'd know any of my neighbours in London. Coming from Frinton-on-Sea, I thought London would just be a place where you just didn't know anybody. We started to get to know our neighbours. After a while, Lisa told me a story one day. She said, hey, there was a knock at the door this afternoon about 4 o'clock. Schoolboy's on the front door step. He's about 13 years old in his school uniform. He says to Lisa, would you walk down the street with me? There's a bunch of lads down the street and I'm scared to walk past them. Would you walk down with me? Lisa didn't recognize who he was. When you get a schoolboy knock on your door in the middle of the afternoon in London, you're more so looking over his shoulder to try and check out where all the others are. She suddenly realized who he was. He's the son of a couple that live down our street, Helen and Martin, who both work away, and he gets to come home on his own. He said, my mum said to me, if you ever don't feel safe, knock at number 2. Isn't that incredible? It still kind of makes me choke as I say it. It's my wife's story, but I think, and it did for Lisa. She was like, if you ever don't feel safe, knock at number 2. We learnt during lockdown, didn't we, that every street's a parish and every home's a church. We have to recover that. We have to recover it, the significance of that. God's mission is worked out through people in their everyday contexts. And our mission is not just to save people. I think it was Charles Colson who said, we have concentrated as the church for far too long on personal salvation. We have to wake up to the whole big story of God. He says it's more than robust enough to cope with the challenges that we face today. When I was growing up in church life, mission was done by other people who went to other places. And I think the third and last thing is this. We need to release our people, our disciples, from starting missional communities to being a missional community. I'll be careful in this because I imagine a lot of us in the room, because it's quite a current thing, our church might do missional communities. And as I wrote this, I thought I wanted to kind of provoke our thinking, but at the same time be careful with it. I grew up with the idea that missionaries were people that went to other places, or that mission was that we as a church did a Love Balham weekend, and then we pat ourselves on the back that we did mission over the weekend. Or we hear about missional communities today, people going to the park and kind of serving the community there. And they're great things, but you've got to know why you're doing them. You're doing them to practice who you're meant to be all of the time. We are a missional people. How do we help and equip our people to be missional people on site? How do we equip that? I, as a church leader now, constantly look at that picture of myself when I was 21 years old, and I think, how do I equip him to be that priest? What does he need to know so that when someone says to him, Mum died last week, or when somebody says to him, my marriage is coming apart, how does he know what to do? I know folk who have been Christians for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Some of them, most of the miserable people I've ever met, or they have no idea how to pray for somebody else. And we have to give them a much broader vision of what it is to do that mission. You know, with LICC, we had this resource called Fruitfulness in the Front Line. It changed me, and I've heard it change so many, because it gives a much broader vision of what difference we can make. Friends of mine have gone out into the world of work, and they said, I've never told anybody at work that I'm a Christian. Why? Because I think they're going to ask me to explain it. They want me to be a messenger of the gospel. Most people would rather go to the dentist than evangelize. And even when you go to the dentist, you know you're meant to open your mouth, but you're fairly sure that when you do, something awful is going to happen. And I think that's how people feel when they're out in the workplace. But what if we said, why don't you go out and think about your character? I bet if we asked one another, our lives were probably changed more by somebody in the way that they were than anything else. I knew as a bricklayer that if I did good work, it said something to those around me. It displayed the gospel. We can mold the culture, shape the way we do things around here, whether that's in your family, workplace, wherever it may be. Model grace and love, minister grace and love rather. Be a mouthpiece for truth and justice. Speak up on behalf of those who can't speak for themselves. I remember hearing about a guy he's a lifelong supporter of Arsenal. I don't know if that's an oxymoron, Christian and a lifelong supporter of Arsenal. But anyway, he heard that the club didn't pay the London living wage, and so he challenged them, and they changed their policy. Then maybe think about being a messenger of the gospel. One last quote, one last challenge, and then some questions on the table. One of the things that us as church leaders have to release ourselves from is we are not the main event. Mark said it this way. He said, the average student has more opportunities for evangelism than most pastors. The average parent at the school gate has more opportunity for pastoral care than most pastors. And the average grandparent has more opportunities for one-to-one discipleship than the average pastor. And yet they've neither been envisioned nor equipped for it. How do we release our congregations to change the world? If you're a church leader in the room, get over the ABC approach. You'll think constantly, particularly after lockdown, about attendance, buildings, and cash. Don't worry about that. Start thinking about the D and the E, disciple making and equipping. That's what will help our people to go out and change their world. I think we're going to talk on the table. Sorry if I went over a little bit. I have no idea. Come and see us on the stand. I meant to put a clock on, but
So I love it, Steve. Thank you so much.